Hello, everybody. Welcome to Live from New Amsterdam. This is a monthly informal conversation with people doing interesting work in the field of New Netherlands studies. It's brought to you by the New Amsterdam Project at the New York Historical Society and by the New Netherland Institute in Albany, New York. Most of the time, often, these conversations are with someone who is doing interesting work in the field of New Netherland itself, that is to say, from 1624 to 1664. After 1664, it became New York. In the case of today, our guest is Iris Plessius, who is doing fascinating new research in the period just after that, in the decades after the English takeover of 1664. So I'd like to bring Iris on the stage, or Iris to give her English pronunciation. And there she is. Welcome, Iris. It's nice to see you.
Nice to see you too.
Thank you for being here from Amsterdam, where it's lunchtime here and it's dinner time there. Iris is a Ph.D. student at Radboud University in the Dutch city of Nijmegen. She was a Fulbright scholar at Cornell University and also to the Onondaga Nation. And Iris, let me begin by asking you to give us an overview of your studies, and in particular, what you're focused on, I think, is kind of a three-way struggle for relevance between the English, the Dutch, and the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. I'm researching the relationship between the Dutch colonists and the indigenous nations in New York State in the late 17th, early 18th century, or to be precise, from 1674 to 1755. And I'm looking how the Dutch and the Native Americans are working together underneath the overall English, the English that are in place there. So I'm researching historical documents and trying to find out about the powers between these three different groups.
And generally speaking, people, if people have some awareness of this history, they may have a notion that once the English came, the Dutch went away or something. But in fact, they stayed, and this whole mix of different ethnicities pretty much remained. And the Dutch remained pretty strong in their position for quite a long time. And then you had this jockeying for position between the Dutch, the English, who were growing in supremacy, and the Haudenosaunee. So tell us how did you come into this topic?
Actually, I was doing an internship at the National Museum of Ethnology here in Leiden, and I was talking to Peter Hovens, who was the curator on the North American department, and we were talking about Dutch indigenous relations in general, and he said to me that the Dutch indigenous relations during the time of the Netherlands were extremely interesting, but there should also be some interesting stuff after 1674. So I decided during my vacation in New York to go to the New York Historical Society, and there I found the Gilder-Lehrman documents, and I started researching them. And I found a document that was written in Middle Dutch, Old Dutch, and the title above it in English, it said, "Gifts exchanged between the Dutch and the Native Americans." So I thought, oh, this is interesting. I'm going to read this document while I'm here. And while I started reading it, I came to find out that it wasn't about the gifts that they exchanged between another, but it was a list of 2 rows about who killed who during the Battle of Schenectady. So a different type of gift.
Right. And so that one of the things that when we were talking earlier about this, one thing that you've discovered is that you've got translations going on, and things that appear in Dutch and things that appear in English often don't match up.
No, that's correct. So most of the documents that I find are propositions to the Native Americans written in Dutch. Then I also found an answer to that proposition written in Dutch as well. And then, of course, there's also an answer in English. And sometimes when you compare them, there are significant differences. For instance, in one of the propositions, before the actual negotiations, the Native Americans had a or the Haudenosaunee had a practice of exchanging gifts before they would actually start a negotiation. And apparently at one point, the Dutch gave a very small string of beads. And then in the documents, it actually says that the Native Americans actually searched within their pile of beaver pelts and gave the smallest beaver pelt in return. That is not in a Dutch document, but that is in the English document. They actually made a little emphasis in saying that it was a small beaver pelt.
So they're aware of the shortcomings of this of the other group.
Yes, and they actually include that, not in the Dutch document, but they did include that in the English document. And there's other things that they leave out or put in. If you compare and contrast them, if you put them together, sometimes the Dutch document is a lot longer than the English one, and just leave fragments out.
Yeah, I want to tell people that we will, at about 20 minutes past the hour, we'll have time for your questions. If you would like to type any questions you may have for Iris into the Q&A, then I'll get to as many of them as I can, and I'll put them to her. So orient us where do these discussions or conversations or where do they take place?
They take place in Albany. In fact, in the courthouse of Albany, most of the time actually in the garden in front of it. Albany during that time becomes the capital of diplomacy. For a long time it's the capital of trade, but then it also becomes the capital of diplomacy. And the Native Americans, mostly of the Haudenosaunee, so the Cayuga, Onondaga, Mohawk, they come to this place where they have the negotiations. And what's very interesting is the agency of the Native Americans as well within all of these procedures, because one time one of the Dutch colonists that came from far away asked, well, why can't you come to us, to our place to negotiate? And then the Native Americans clearly made clear that the only place they want to negotiate is at Albany at the courthouse. So they refused to go to a different location.
And why did they see that, that spot in front of the courthouse? Do you have a sense of why they saw that as the place they wanted to meet?
So the other place that they suggested to meet was in Maryland and Virginia, because in this particular case, apparently warriors from the Seneca had gone into Maryland and Virginia. So the people that were in charge of Maryland and Virginia came all the way to Albany to discuss, and then asked if the natives could come to Maryland and Virginia the next time, and they refused. And I think it also because it's closer to their nations, and this is to them was the ground of diplomacy. For them, that was the ground of negotiation, and that it should remain that way.
And so this was where they met with the Europeans, whether they were Dutch or English.
And that's also very clearly stated on the documents. So on the documents, it's stated which of the Dutch people are there. It's also stated which of the native sachems are there, and also indicated who is the speaker. And they also indicate who is the interpreter, and then some of the English officials that might be there. And interestingly enough, the names of the native sachems for a long time had issues figuring out who that might be. And then when I was in the US and I was at the Native American Reservation, the Onondaga Nation, the native sachems there asked me to say the names in Dutch pronunciation. And when I said them, they realized who they were and it could actually help me out. So some things were indeed lost in translation.
Yeah, and then you were able from that to, once you had those names, once they heard it and then said it back to you, were you able to kind of track those figures?
Yes, because one of the things that I find extremely important in my research, and something we talked about before, is I'm talking about a relationship. So therefore, I find it very important that when we're talking about a relationship, you bring up both sides. So one of my goals while being at the American Indian and Indigenous Studies program at Cornell University was to try to find and uncover, to the best of my abilities, the perspective of the Native nations.
It's not just, so among the Haudenosaunee, from Albany, you would move west toward the Great Lakes, and that's the territory of the Haudenosaunee, essentially, starting with the Mohawk, who are closest to Albany, and all the way to the Seneca at the western end. Were all of those nations represented at these councils?
So it depends. So sometimes you had sachems from all of the 5 nations coming together, and sometimes they had negotiations with just the sachems of the Mohawk. So these nations also acted independently. So they were together on a confederation, but they're also independently in their own way. So for instance, the example I was talking about, some of the warriors of some nations had gone into the territory of the Virginia and Maryland, and some had not. So for instance, the Cayuga were not part of that negotiation because they had not partaken in it. So it's always very easy to see which nations, but because they write the name of the nations and the name of the sachems.
Where is there one place where these documents are gathered, or are you going all over?
So while I was in the US, I've been all over. Of course, I've also been to the Netherland Institute, but most of them I found within the Gilder-Lehrman Institute. They have beautiful scans of these documents that you can only visit there. And then, of course, they also had all these account books that I also looked at. I tried to look as much documents as possible, but most of my materials I actually got from the New York Historical Society. Of course, I also been to the Newberry Library in Chicago. So I tried, like I've been to many different places, but the majority of my material comes from the New York Historical Society.
And is that the Gilder-Lehrman collection? Okay. So are these gatherings, are they monthly? Are they yearly? What's the, is it just as a topic comes up?
Yes, that seems to be the case as a topic comes up. So sometimes I have examples of a row of documents of at least 4 meetings, but then of course, sometimes that also means that the first time the Mohawk come, then the Cayuga come for basically the same kind of discussion, a little bit different monitored to the different specifics of that particular nation. But also have months in which it's a little less. So for instance, during the winter months, there's a little bit less. Of course, there's a lot less travel back then. But mostly the meetings are quite regular, and that of course eventually result into the establishment of the Albany Commissioner of Indian Affairs, in which only Dutch people were employed. So in the period between 1674 and 1696, it is mostly these Dutch magistrates who take care of these things in addition to their other activities, and then they get this specific position that they hold up until 1755.
Can you characterize, and maybe it, I'm sure it evolves over this period of time, the relative power of these 3 groups, essentially the Haudenosaunee, the Dutch, and the English?
So to me, the way I look at it is that, so the overarching power, of course, are the English, and the Dutch trying to find a way to maintain a prominent position within the colonial society. And they do that in negotiating with the Native Americans. But of course, the negotiation with the Native Americans also results in trade, which of course benefits them tremendously. And so the Dutch also depend a little bit on the Native Americans to make these negotiations go smoothly in a way. So the Native nations also benefit from it, but so they are actually working together underneath that overarching power of the English, and in a way both try to survive and thrive under that power.
So are you saying that the Dutch and the Haudenosaunee are supporting one another? They see each other as kind of allies?
Well, once again, in the wording, sometimes they refer to the, if you look at some of the documents, they refer to the natives as brothers. But there are also occasions that they refer to them as children. That is something that the Haudenosaunee immediately stop, and actually within the answer of the Native nations immediately answer, we're not, that's a different kind of relationship. We are brothers in this. So I'm pretty sure that sometimes there is a little bit of a power struggle, but most of the time when they're addressing one another, it's in the term of brothers. The Dutch try the children and father kind of idea, and also refer then that they then bring in the King of England and say, you know, the great king, our great father across the ocean, he is in charge and we need to abide by his rules. But in every proposition that has to do with the Haudenosaunee, they'll come back to those terms and say something about that. So they are looking more at like a brother relationship, like a balanced relationship. while the Dutch, of course, sometimes try to overrule.
And as you get later in the period, when you get to 1750, has that changed?
Well, the position of the Dutch among underneath the English, because eventually all the Albany commissioners of Indian Affairs are fired and they are replaced by just one person. So the position of, once the English take over, then of course the position of the Dutch as well as the Native American diminishes somewhat. So in the beginning, the English to me still very much depend on the Dutch for those foreign diplomacy, for that foreign policies in dealing with the Native Americans. And as time progressed, the Dutch kind of lose their connection. They do not do as well as the English would like, or they're not progressing all of that. So then you see that there's a slight shift in the position of the Dutch as well as the Native Americans in the colonial society.
I always try to envision and sort of put myself into these kinds of situations in the past. Can you sort of, reading between the lines of documents, can you help us to kind of see and feel and smell the scene in front of the courthouse in Albany? How many people are they? Are the Haudenosaunee sitting here and the Dutch are over there and the English are over there, or how can you help us to see it a little more?
Such a great question, because that's what Hans Bak and my other promoter, Jaap Verheul, they want to hear the squeaky floors of that courthouse in Albany.
Yeah.
At these situations. So there's a lot of people involved, because only the sachems are involved, for instance, on the Native American side, in the conversation with the Dutch. But that doesn't mean that they come alone. They come with entire fractions of their nations that they have to go back to discuss matters discussed. So these negotiations took days. Wasn't like they could come together. So sometimes they discussed something, and then the Native Americans, the sachems, had to go back to members of their nation to talk about it, and they also came along, which is something that, with between the lines, you notice that the Dutch are a little bit annoyed about, because they want to get on with business. So on the native side, there's huge numbers. On the Dutch side, when I look at the documents and I base myself on what I see in the documents, there are approximately 5 to 10 Dutch people involved, and usually 3 to 4 English officials. Usually it's one interpreter, like Gerrit van Slichterhoofd or Arnoud Cornelissen, but sometimes they're also together in case if there's a large group. The one thing that I always find interesting that's missing is, of course, we only have the words. We don't have the expressions or what's happening or what anybody else is doing. But most of the time they find themselves in front of the courthouse, outside, negotiating, sitting on opposite sides as well. And then the native sachems sit in front, and all of their part of their nations are behind them, or sometimes in different locations. So they have to go back and forth to discuss what's being discussed.
And I know that generally speaking, at these kinds of councils, it would be an elaborate affair, and there would be food and drink and speeches and gifts exchanged and so on.
Yes, very much so. So for instance, behind every proposition that is mentioned in which they agree on something, there's gifts exchanged. So for instance, in my documents, it also says strings of wampum, how high they are, how tall they are, what they look like, sometimes even on the intricate designs on the wampum, but also from the European, from the Dutch side, tobacco. And sometimes they also start using wampum as a return gift as well. But it's tobacco, clothing, bread sometimes. So you get a great idea of all of these products that are also there and that are being exchanged. And then by the end, they exchange a little bit more. And to me, what I find fascinating are the descriptions of the wampum, how large they are, because the larger the string of wampum, the more significance it has. And sometimes some of these products are also, there's an amount behind it of how much guilders it actually represents. So they also put a monetary element to it as well, just to indicate how much is given away. So it's a continuous time of giving gifts. It's also a time of sometimes to talk about smoking and drinking and eating. Yeah, that's all included there as well. So it was, I think, a very lively affair.
We should mention that wampum is polished beads that are strung together, and it can be very ornate. And this was a ceremonial among native groups, but the Dutch sort of, as you just alluded to, made it into a kind of currency.
Yeah, so one of the things I find extremely interesting about the Dutch is that they're very much aware of the diplomatic practices of the Haudenosaunee. So they are aware, for instance, about the significance of the tree of life, or of the stream in which the weapons should be thrown above the tree of life, or the different wind directions, or the importance of wampum. So they have this time when they start to produce wampum themselves. These are white shells and purple shells, and then together they make all these. So the two-row wampum is an example that most people might have heard about. And these belts actually stand for the kind of like agreements that the two groups have between one another.
I'm reading some questions now from the audience. This is a good one. Did the English worry about the Dutch having their own relationships with the native peoples?
Oh, I'm pretty sure they did, because one of the things I find interesting is that in a document that actually was returned to the English, things are missing. So they keep things to themselves. They also, I'm pretty sure, had a little trade of themselves on the side. So, but as I already said at the beginning, the English depended so much on the Dutch, as the Dutch had somewhat of, I'm not going to say a good relationship with the native nations, because that's not the case, but they had somewhat of a workable relationship that the English did not. So therefore, the English heavily depended on the Dutch to do all that negotiations. So yeah, I'm pretty sure they had some fear there. And then probably the moment the importance of the Dutch within these negotiations diminishes, that's when the English decide to take over in 1755.
Someone wants to know, do you speak or read any indigenous American languages, and what language skills do you need to complete your research?
So I was part of the American Indian and Indigenous Studies program, and I learned some language there. I worked with many Native American scholars, for instance, Jolene Rickard. But most of the time, the documents that I study are in Dutch and in English. And one of the things I do is when I translate Dutch documents, I provide them, for instance, to the Museum of Onondaga, because one of the things they told me is that they have a lot on English Haudenosaunee diplomacy, or French Haudenosaunee diplomacy, and not so much on Dutch Haudenosaunee diplomacy. So I think in that way, I can contribute to the story, but they, of course, can help me. For instance, finding out who these sachems are, and they've helped me tremendously. I've had interviews with clan mothers. I've had talks with sachems in which they talked about their stories, their rituals, and what they know from that time. And that, of course, I incorporate in my research, which I think, as I said before, it's a relationship. So both sides should be included to the best of my abilities, of course.
Right. Were women involved in diplomatic negotiations?
Yes, there actually is a female interpreter. And the female interpreter, her name is Hilletje. And Hilletje appears in some of the documents. She is European native, so I'm not sure if she's actually from Dutch descent, but she is native European, and she occasionally appears in the documents. And most of the time, when there are negotiations, it's mostly sachems, but sachems are chosen by the clan mothers. So females did have an enormous impact behind the scenes on these negotiations, because they got to determine which sachem they would step forward.
I'm familiar also with Sarah Kierstead, who was a translator. She was in the period of New Netherland and after translator. I know among, I guess, the Munsee peoples, so further south, but I believe she was born in Albany or in Beverwijk at that time. So she was also often listed as the interpreter or translator.
Okay, yeah, I will look into it. So
I don't know if you're familiar with her or not. How did the role or status of Albany as a city change after 1664? Did the commercial or military role change?
So before the end of New Netherlands, most of the focus, of course, is on New Amsterdam, New York, and there's a little bit of shift when it comes to the Dutch. The Dutch mostly live in the area of Beverwijk, but then it becomes Albany, of course, and that is already the capital of trade, but then also becomes the capital of diplomacy. So in my opinion, the importance of Albany does rise, of course.
So partly, I guess you're saying because of the importance of the Haudenosaunee who were in that region.
Yes, and because of the diplomacy was extremely important as it's part of the English policy in the area. So it raises the importance of Albany because of the location of the Haudenosaunee, and the Dutch are there, and that's actually helps with that.
Yeah. Someone wants you to put the French into the picture here. Were they part of, how do they complicate the story?
They did. So of course, there's a lot of power struggles between the French and English at the time, and both the French and English tried to get the Haudenosaunee involved and to fight on their sides. And even though the Dutch are asked by the English to negotiate with the Haudenosaunee to join the English side, some of them actually do join the French side. So that complicates the entire situation tremendously, because the Dutch in a way lose their grip then on these people because they start moving towards the French. So whenever there is a power struggle between the English and the French, the Native Americans make a decision which side they're going to go with, and the Dutch are also in the middle of that as well.
Another question is, did all Dutch colonists become British subjects after 1664? Did they have the choice to remain Dutch and live in New York?
So the way I view it is that in public, they would come a little bit more English, but privately, they would remain very much Dutch. At least that's also what I saw when I visited a mentor of Peter Schuiler. So privately, they remained within the Dutch Reformed Church. They married only Dutch people. They hold on to their Dutch traditions. And they remained very, very Dutch privately. And I think more publicly, they would become a little bit more English, a little bit more of the subjects to the British Crown. But that's also, to me, a way of surviving if you have to deal with an overarching power that is the British. So it's trying to like balancing what works for you.
So officially they were subjects of the British Crown, but they very much kept their networks and language and so on.
Yes. So like also when you look at some of the marriage records, like most Dutch people only married Dutch people, the Dutch Reformed Church actually remained extremely important. I think it was Jannie Venema who pointed me in the direction, was a very important scholar within the Netherland Institute, pointed me into the direction of a protest somewhere in the 20th century that some of the people that were part of the Dutch Reformed Church had started, because apparently the clergy had decided that they would change the language from Dutch to English in their services, and the Dutch really started to protest against it. So for a long time, that remained very, very Dutch.
Are you planning to publish?
I hope so. That would be fantastic.
Will it be, do you envision a book?
Yes, I would love to. I would love to get published. And one of the things I always find is that, you know, the research should not stay with me, but it should go out there. So hopefully reach as much people as possible. So yes, I'd love to.
How much more work do you envision that you have in front of you?
It's always hard to say. I have fantastic supervisors in Hans Bak and Jaap Verheul who carry me along. The problem I sometimes have is that I'm a little afraid to fail. So sometimes I find it very hard to start writing and keep writing. But they are really encouraging. So far, so good. And hopefully within the near future. Let's keep it that way.
That's wonderful. Iris, this has been wonderful. We've got a huge turnout, great audience for this. There's a lot of interest in this topic. Thanks for talking to us. I've got a couple of announcements. Our next Live from New Amsterdam will be on October 26th with the great Deborah Hamer, who is the director of the New Netherland Institute, who will be talking about the process of translating the official archives of New Netherland publishing and disseminating that, which is the work of the New Netherland Institute. I also want to point out that on October 7th, the New Netherland Institute will have its conference in Albany, New York, and it is on the senses of New Netherlands. So there's going to be a 17th century Dutch musical performance. There's going to be a Haudenosaunee musical performance. It will be on all the senses, possibly with the exception of smell. So that's on October 7th in Albany, and you can go to newnetherlandinstitute.org for information on how to register. Thank you again, Iris. Thank you all, and have a good day.